And of course it's very frustrating because you make the movie and you put out all this effort to make it the best you can. Oh, I was very enthusiastic about this movie, so it's sad when you just all of a sudden they just disappear.
In a previous video, we heard the claim made by Mexican film superstar Jorge Rivero that he made 3 spaghetti westerns, a trilogy in fact, in the 1970s that went missing, that never saw release. Jorge remembers making these 3 westerns in Spain for Italian director Mario Siciliano, playing the character of Sartana, which was a popular black-clad spaghetti western character portrayed across a number of films by multiple actors, both officially and unofficially. So let's look at some possibilities, because 3 films, that's a lot of cinema to go missing with almost no trace of it ever having existed. It's not possible that Jorge dreamt up this whole trilogy, is it? No, it's really not, and I'll later tell you some of the evidence out there that proves this wasn't just Jorge mixing up different bits of his very busy career. But now some spaghetti western fans do seem to think that Jorge is way off base, and their main grounds for that opinion is this photo, which Jorge says he keeps in his home as a souvenir of his missing Sartana films.
It was a great character, like I said, look at it.
So let's get that photo out of the way right up front. Yes, the co-star in that photo looks an awful lot like Mexican actor Mario Almada, with whom Jorge made 7 films together between 1971 and 1980. And in some of those Mexican westerns, like El Hombre, Jorge also wore an all-black outfit, complete with the metal concho hatband that he's seen wearing in a supposed Sartana photo. But I watched El Hombre, and at no time during the film is Mario dressed as he is in the mystery photo. No, he wears a charro outfit for most of the film. In any case, Jorge wore all-black wardrobe in a few Mexican westerns, including Los Hijos de Satanás. But if you'll notice, he doesn't wear the metal concho hatband in that one. But that film is another one that Western fans have tried to argue with me about. This word, Satanás. You know, maybe Jorge is just confusing. No, please stop. Satanás means Satan, Los Hijos de Satanás, the children of Satan. Whereas Sartana, on the other hand, that's just a name with no further meaning in Spanish. That's not something a Spanish speaker would confuse. But Jorge is black-clad with metal concho hatband in 2 other Mexican westerns besides El Hombre, Guns and Guts, and El Cuatro Dedos. As an aside, keep in mind that movie stars like developing an image, so it could make sense to have similar wardrobe in multiple films. Hell, Fred Williamson, the American star Fred Williamson, he did the black-clad thing too, even with a concho hatband, in films like Joshua and Take a Hard Ride. Anyways, El Cuatro Dedos co-stars Mario Almada again, and this time Mario is wearing the same serape as in the photo that Jorge says is from a Sartana film. So it really calls into question whether this photo in Jorge's house is from an Italian Western or not. But I do have a weird theory about that I'll come back to. Now, what about the film director Mario Siciliano that Jorge remembers helming his 3 Sartana films? Well, yes, Jorge did make a film for director Siciliano that did get released.
Mal di Occhio.
AKA Evil Eye, AKA Masala del Exorcismo, a half-hearted possession film where, frankly, very little happens. And director Mario Siciliano did make some unofficial Sartana films that did get released. Specifically, Trinity and Sartana Are Coming, and Hallelujah and Sartana Strike Again. Just none with Jorge that got released. So if Mario Siciliano did make Sartana films, and Jorge did make a Mario Siciliano film, maybe Jorge just got something mixed up that way. After all, he made films at a blistering pace in his heyday, as many as 8 a year during the 1970s. But Jorge making a mistake like this, it's just not likely, not considering the amount of detail he remembered, the 4-month shooting schedule for instance, and the fact that he didn't make any other Italian westerns in Spain that he might be confusing these with. And even if someone's film career was a blur, he might be confused about a single film years later, but he wouldn't erroneously invent an entire trilogy in his head. And are we expected to believe that Jorge dreamt up all his many efforts to contact the production company to later locate these missing films? Outside of the couple Hollywood studio films that he made, Jorge has had an independent film career where disappearing movies are a frightening possibility.
Listen, this is not the first time it happens to me. Not only with the Sartanas, it has happened, like I said, it has happened to me maybe 2 or 3 times, especially independent movies. You know, in movies like this, you never know. Sometimes they owe money. Sometimes they have to pay with money. Sometimes they can't release the movie because somebody sued them. So I really don't know.
So who knows what the story is? Now, one of my colleagues has a pretty good theory. He wonders if Jorge's Sartana films were a case of changing trends. See, the Italian cinema was very fad-oriented. By the mid-1970s, when Jorge's Sartana films would have likely been made, the Italian westerns were long past their heyday. Much more trendy at the time were the Italian-made copies of The Exorcist, films like The Antichrist and The House of Exorcism. So my colleague theorizes that yes, Jorge shot the 3 Sartana films with director Mario Siciliano, but before they could go through post-production, Jorge and Mario were offered the opportunity to do Masala del Exorcismo, and they jumped on the opportunity at the expense of finishing the Sartana films. It's just a theory, but I asked Jorge which came first, the Sartana films or Masala del Exorcismo. One time, Jorge said he wasn't sure.
So these were before or after you did Masala del Exorcismo?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know whether I made that one first or...
But another time, Jorge seemed pretty sure that he made Masala del Exorcismo first, had a break in between, then went back to Spain to make the westerns.
Más allá del exorcismo, exactly. That's the movie that I met him. And from there on, I made those 3 movies.
Okay. Now, did you make all of those while, all of them in a row?
No, I came to Mexico, and I did several things before, and then he called me back, I went, and that's when we did the movies.
So if that's the case, my colleague's theory about abandoning the westerns to make a trendier horror film, it doesn't hold water. Now let's finally get around to the evidence that says these films weren't just Jorge getting confused. See, all the online mentions of these films seem to be from info that originally came from me and my interviews with Jorge, with one exception. Yeah, here's the one scrap of outside confirmation that I've found. Sometime in the decade of the 2000s, the aughts, I was on the Spaghetti Western web board, the biggest gathering place for genre experts pre-social media. And having just interviewed Jorge Rivero by phone, I asked what anyone else knew about his claims of these lost Sartana films. Michael Ferguson of Toronto, Ontario, he replied, saying a fellow Toronto resident had some promotional brochures about the Rivero Sartana trilogy. Toronto, Ontario? Yeah, turns out there was a theater in Toronto called the Paradise, owned by the Giacomini family, that only screened Italian-language films during the 1970s. This included spaghetti westerns. Now, in order to get these Italian films for Canadian exhibition, the family formed a company, Paradise Film Exchange, and family members traveled back and forth between Canada and Italy to make the deals happen. Michael Ferguson, this member of the Spaghetti Western web board I was conversing with, had befriended Walter Giacomini, who was just a young usher for the Paradise Theater in the 1970s. But Walter's father, in his work for Paradise Film Exchange, had been sent promotional brochures for the Jorge Rivero Sartana films, possibly for booking the films once they were done, but possibly because the productions needed more investment to finish shooting or for post-production. Michael thinks the brochures were for prospective investors and that Walter's father decided against investing, but kept the brochures. Walter was willing to show the brochures to Michael, but unfortunately Walter sustained a life-changing injury in the 1990s and he fell out of touch. If the 3 Sartana films needed, but failed to find, finishing funds in order to be completed, that would certainly fit Jorge's memories that they were truly produced in the first place, and then also makes sense as to why they disappeared. So what do I think happened here? Well, a crazy idea has occurred to me, so I'm just thinking aloud here. But we know that Jorge Rivero made 3 Mexican films as a black-clad gunslinger. We know that he claimed to make a trilogy, 3 films, as Sartana, who's typically represented on screen as a black-clad gunslinger. We know that Jorge remembers this photo with Mario Almada as being from one of his Sartana films. And we know that Mario Almada appeared in 2 of the 3 Mexican films where Jorge plays the black-clad gunslinger. We know that Jorge had a relationship with Italian director Mario Siciliano, and we know that Mario Siciliano was very into the Sartana character, not only directing those 2 unofficial Sartana films, but also being the producer of the film that, technically, gave birth to the Sartana character, or at least the idea to do the Sartana character. So, what if Jorge Rivero and Mario Siciliano, who each own their own production companies, by the way, what if they concocted a plan to redub Jorge's black-clad Mexican westerns as 3 Sartana films? And since the films would now be a trilogy, they might need at least a little continuity. So what if Siciliano did bring Jorge to Almeria, Spain, as Jorge remembers, and what if they did shoot some new material, so as to create some scenes that would bridge the 3 stories? Of course, there are some problems with this theory. Jorge remembered a 4-month shoot in Spain to create the 3 Sartana films. And if Mario Siciliano really just shot a few new scenes to add some artificial continuity to the 3 Mexican films, well, that wouldn't have taken 4 months. And also, Jorge gives the impression that the 3 Sartana films were likely made in the middle 1970s, and the last of the 3 Mexican westerns Rivero made in this wardrobe, El Cuatro Dedos, that was released in 1978, a little late. In any case, this is not just crazy old Jorge Rivero making some far-fetched claims with guys like Mike Malloy and Michael Ferguson eager to believe him. The well-respected spaghetti western Dizionario by Marco Giusti mentions the Rivero Sartana films, at least 2 of them, in an appendix for the book. Now that dictionary has a 2007 publication date, and that may have been the year after I started discussing these lost films on the Spaghetti Western web board. But even if the author, Giusti, got his information by reading those online discussions between me and Michael Ferguson, I'm sure he did some digging in order to corroborate. This is considered one of the most trusted books on the genre. And that's what I have for you. Besides Jorge's memories, the strongest evidence is those investment brochures that turned up in Toronto. Even if we can't find the films themselves, it would be great to see the brochures with whatever info, photos, or artwork they contain. But there is hope. Jorge was worried about another film he made.
Listen, recently I made a movie called The Pearl by John Steinbeck. The movie hasn't been released. I made it, let me tell you, I made it in 2001. I made that movie. Disappeared, the movie. The Pearl, and with Richard Harris.
But I found a copy of that, no sweat, and I sent him a DVD. So sometimes things aren't as lost as we think.